He didn't die in Moscow. That would have been cleaner. Cleaner leaves a body. Cleaner leaves paperwork. What happened instead was worse. One day, he was reporting in from a cafe off Tverskaya, complaining about the coffee like every other Brit pretending to blend in. 2 days later, he vanished. No arrest record, no CCTV trail worth trusting, no body in the river. And when MI6 did what MI6 always does, pull the file, check the backstory, retrace the legend they built for him, they found something that shouldn't be possible. The man they'd trained, deployed, trusted with sensitive sources inside Russia had no birth record. Not altered, not sealed, not classified. Gone, as if the state that created him had blinked and forgotten. You can fake a passport, you can ghost a bank account, but you cannot erase a childhood without someone noticing, unless the childhood was never there to begin with. And that's the part no one in London wanted to say out loud, because if he'd never been born, then who exactly had they been sending into Moscow for the last 3 years? Before we go deeper, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you believe a government can accidentally erase a man. You'll want your answer on record before this story bends it. Stories like this don't survive unless people keep talking about them. And trust me, by the end, you'll have questions. His Moscow alias was Daniel Rowe, mid-level trade consultant, too boring to notice. He rented a narrow flat with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed like it had secrets. He jogged in the mornings, always the same route, always past the same kiosk where the old woman sold cigarettes one at a time. Patterns matter in spy work, predictable enough to seem real, flexible enough to disappear. The last confirmed sighting was 08:17 a.m., snow half melted, gray slush at the curb. He bought a black coffee, didn't finish it. CCTV caught him glancing at something across the street. Not fear, recognition. That detail haunted analysts later. You don't look like that at danger. You look like that at someone you know. His handler in London received a dead drop message 12 hours late. That's not catastrophic. Delays happen. The message itself was routine, minor update about a contact in the energy sector. No distress code, no deviation. If anything, too normal, overly normal, like someone performing calm. When he missed his next check-in, they initiated soft recovery protocols. Nothing loud, no diplomatic noise, just quiet pings across systems, immigration logs, transit cards, banking activity, all flat. The digital silence was neat, too neat. Moscow is messy, data there leaves crumbs. He left none. Then someone in Vauxhall Cross made a procedural call that changed everything. Run a full archive verification, not just current identity, everything. School records, medical history, national insurance trail, birth certificate, the works. It was supposed to be a formality, a box tick before escalation. Instead, it opened a hole. The birth certificate returned as invalid, not red flag invalid, not fraud invalid. It simply didn't exist in the registry. They checked alternate spellings, hospital archives, midwife logs. Nothing. His supposed hometown in Kent had no memory of the family listed. Electoral rolls, empty. It wasn't that the data had been scrubbed recently. It looked like it had never been there. Analysts don't panic. They rationalize. Clerical error, corrupted archive, Cold War record gaps. But when they pulled internal MI6 training records, something else surfaced. His intake file had been uploaded 3 years ago by a senior officer who retired 18 months ago. The metadata showed edits, minor ones, date formatting, clearance stamps, but the original upload timestamp glitched, showing a creation date that predated the digital system itself. Someone muttered a word no intelligence service likes hearing about itself. Fabrication. Not of documents, of reality. And that's where this stops being about a missing spy and starts being about a question that keeps people in government buildings awake at night. What if the system didn't just lose a man? What if it created one without knowing how?
The first rule inside any intelligence agency is simple: assume compromise before conspiracy. So they started there. Maybe Moscow had breached something. Maybe a cyber unit inside the FSB had slipped into British civil registries and wiped him retroactively. It wouldn't be the first time digital fingerprints got rearranged. But the deeper forensic team dug, the stranger it looked. There were no deletion markers, no overwrite signatures, no ghost entries in the audit trails. It wasn't that someone had erased his birth. It was that the database behaved as if his birth had never been entered in the first place. They widened the circle. Education records, primary school in Maidstone, supposed classmates. One responded to outreach through a cutout channel, said he remembered a Daniel, tall kid, good at maths, rubbish at football. The details sounded human. But when analysts cross-checked the school yearbooks, Daniel Rowe wasn't in any of them, not blurred, not mislabeled, just absent. The class photo the former classmate described did exist. The tall kid he remembered had a different name. That's when the tone shifted from procedural to uneasy. You can fabricate paper trails, but you don't accidentally fabricate shared memories, unless those memories were seeded or suggested. His handler, a woman named Claire, who had worked Eastern Europe desks for a decade, requested a psychological profile reevaluation. She insisted he was real. She had trained him, sat across from him in briefing rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet glue. She remembered his sarcasm, the way he tapped a pen twice before answering anything sensitive. You don't invent that, or maybe you do. They pulled CCTV from MI6's own facility during his training period. There he was, entering the building, swiping access, sitting in seminars, shaking hands at his graduation assessment. Multiple cameras, multiple angles, biometric verification matched, fingerprints on file, DNA sample archived, real, tangible, flesh and blood. But when they checked the intake authorization, the senior officer who had signed him in, Sir Malcolm Avery, left the service under quiet circumstances, early retirement, health reasons officially. Unofficially, a disagreement over non-standard recruitment pipelines. That phrase suddenly felt heavier. Claire flew to his supposed hometown under a cover audit assignment. She walked the streets Daniel claimed to have grown up on, semi-detached houses, a corner shop that still sold warm cans of cola in summer. She knocked on doors using a fabricated insurance pretext. No one remembered the Rowe family, not vaguely, not distantly. It was like chasing smoke through brick walls. Back in London, a junior analyst noticed something buried in the intake system logs. Daniel's personnel number wasn't sequential. It sat between two codes assigned nearly 15 years apart, like someone had slotted him into a historical gap. It wasn't a clerical error, it was deliberate placement. The internal review team started asking a question no one wanted formally documented. Was Daniel Rowe a deep cover asset built from scratch? Not a fake passport and accent job, an entire human backstory constructed internally and inserted into operations as if it were organic, a ghost born inside the agency. But if that were true, why would the agency not remember building him? Meanwhile, in Moscow, local sources began going dark. One energy consultant canceled a meeting and left the city. Another stopped answering encrypted messages. It was subtle, but it suggested Daniel's network believed something had happened. Fear spreads faster than facts in that city. Claire replayed her last conversation with him over and over. He'd made a joke about the snow feeling too clean, said Moscow in winter looks like it's hiding something. At the time, it sounded like idle commentary. Now it felt like subtext. Then the final anomaly surfaced. His DNA sample in MI6's archive matched no existing British medical database entries. That alone wasn't catastrophic. Not everyone's DNA is national systems. But it also didn't match the parents listed on his file. In fact, those parents' national insurance numbers belonged to two unrelated deceased individuals. This wasn't identity theft. It was architectural. And somewhere between London and Moscow, a man who officially never been born was either running for his life or fulfilling a purpose no one had clearance to admit existed.
The moment DNA didn't match, the room changed temperature. Analysts who had been leaning back in chairs sat forward. Screens glowed brighter. Nobody said it out loud, but the implication was obvious. If Daniel wasn't who the system said he was, and the system didn't know it had built him, then either the agency had been compartmentalized beyond recognition, or someone inside had run a parallel program off the books. Sir Malcolm Avery's name kept resurfacing like a bad conscience. His retirement file was thin, too thin for someone who had overseen multiple Eastern European operations. Claire requested access to his archived communications. Denied. She requested again, this time invoking operational risk tied to an active disappearance inside Russian territory. Partial approval came through. Select emails, redacted attachments, just enough to feel controlled. 3 years earlier, Avery had exchanged a series of encrypted internal memos about legacy methodologies. The phrasing sounded academic, almost nostalgic, but one line stood out. The next-generation asset must not merely adopt a legend, he must be indistinguishable from origin. At the time, it probably read like philosophical tradecraft. Now it felt literal. Meanwhile, in Moscow, winter turned harsher. The cafe where Daniel had been last seen reported that a man had asked about him the day after his disappearance. Not police, not uniformed, civilian coat, quiet voice, paid in cash. The barista remembered one detail. The man pronounced Daniel's alias slightly wrong, stressing the wrong syllable, like someone who had read the name but never heard it spoken. That detail didn't make the report. It stayed in Claire's private notes. Back in London, they pulled biometric archives from Daniel's training years, retinal scans, voice pattern recordings, micro-expression analysis from interrogation simulations. Everything aligned internally. He was consistent, too consistent. Most recruits showed drift under stress tests. Daniel's metrics were stable across environments, almost engineered stability. A junior data scientist, sleep-deprived and irritated, decided to run an anomaly comparison against historical black operations databases, programs so compartmentalized that even their names were obscured. He wasn't looking for answers, he was looking for patterns. Something odd emerged. In the late 1990s, a pilot initiative explored synthetic identity immersion. The goal wasn't fake passports, it was psychological embedding, training in operatives so deeply in a constructed life that even polygraphs would validate it. The program had been shut down, officially. Claire tracked down Avery's former deputy, a man now teaching security ethics at a private university. Over coffee in a room that smelled faintly of chalk and old carpet, she asked him directly, "Was Daniel real?" The deputy didn't flinch. He stirred his tea twice before answering. "Real enough to bleed," he said. That was always the threshold. That wasn't an answer. It was a warning. Then came the Moscow development that forced escalation. An FSB leak, subtle, unofficial, circulated through diplomatic back channels. They weren't announcing an arrest. They were hinting at something stranger. "We are aware your man does not exist," the message implied. No names, just that phrase repeated through indirect language. It wasn't a threat. It was bait. London froze. If the Russians knew Daniel's records were empty, it meant one of two things. Either they had uncovered the anomaly independently, or someone inside MI6 had tipped them. Claire went back to Daniel's final dead-drop message. Routine update, minor economic intel. She ran linguistic analysis not for content, but for rhythm. Something was off. He had omitted one habitual phrase he always used at the end of secure transmissions. It wasn't a code, it was a personality tick, and its absence felt deliberate. She zoomed in on the metadata timestamp. The message had been sent from the correct coordinates, but the encryption handshake showed a micro delay, milliseconds out of alignment with his usual signal profile. To anyone else, invisible. To her, it screamed interference. If Daniel had realized his own existence was compromised, if he had discovered he was built rather than born, what would that do to a mind trained to operate in ambiguity? And more importantly, if MI6 had once experimented with creating operatives whose pasts were institutional fabrications, what happened to one of them who began asking about his childhood? Because sometimes the most dangerous spy isn't the one captured by the enemy. It's the one who discovers the truth about himself. Claire didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid for Daniel, because she was afraid of him. There's a difference. If he had uncovered the truth that his parents were dead strangers, that his hometown was architectural fiction, that even his childhood memories might have been curated through suggestion and immersion training, then Moscow wasn't just hostile territory, it was an escape route. And maybe he hadn't vanished because the Russians took him. Maybe he walked. The question now wasn't whether MI6 had lost a spy, it was whether they had created one who no longer belonged to them. Claire drove to Avery's country home without authorization. It was raining because England insists on drama at the worst moments. Avery opened the door himself, older, thinner, eyes sharp in a way that suggested retirement hadn't dulled him at all. She didn't waste time. "Did you build him?" Avery didn't answer immediately. He stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. Bookshelves lined the walls. No photos of family, just framed historical documents and old intelligence citations. "We didn't build him," Avery said finally. "We assembled him." That word hit differently. He explained it like a man describing a chess strategy. The agency had identified individuals with fragmented pasts, orphans, refugees, undocumented children from collapsed administrative systems, people who technically existed but whose records were inconsistent. The program's goal wasn't to invent humans, it was to refine them, polish the gaps, insert continuity, create operatives whose official histories were minimal enough to manipulate, yet authentic enough to withstand scrutiny. "He had a birth," Avery said, "just not one you could verify in a tidy database." "But the DNA doesn't match," Claire shot back. "DNA databases don't define parenthood. Paperwork does." It was a deflection. She pressed harder. "Did he know?" Avery's jaw tightened. "Not at first." That was the fracture point. If Daniel discovered that his childhood memories had been shaped, curated, maybe even partially implanted through immersive conditioning, if he realized that his sense of self had been weaponized, then Moscow wasn't just hostile territory, it was an escape route. And maybe he hadn't vanished because the Russians took him, maybe he walked. The question now wasn't whether MI6 had lost a spy, it was whether they had created one who no longer belonged to them.
The interrogation of Subject 88 did not begin with questions. It began with silence. A deliberate, engineered silence. The kind designed to fracture composure before a single word is spoken. The room was excessively white, aggressively sterile, surgically controlled. Nothing inside it was accidental. The lighting was calibrated to eliminate shadows, removing psychological comfort zones. The table was bolted to the floor. The chairs were asymmetrical, one subtly lower than the other. Even power dynamics were embedded in the furniture. Every camera angle eliminated blind spots. Every microphone was tuned to capture breath fluctuations, throat tension, involuntary swallowing. Across the steel surface sat the man who officially did not exist. His hands rested flat, steady, veins visible but unmoving, no tremor, no tapping, no defensive body language. His gaze was fixed forward, not at the interrogator, not at the mirror, not at the cameras. It was as if he was looking through the wall, beyond the facility, beyond the country, beyond the idea of identity itself. There was no birth certificate, no passport, no tax history, no school records, no medical files, no digital footprint. According to every British database, he had never been born. MI6 did not panic when anomalies appear. They audit, they cross-verify, they escalate. First came the internal system check, no corruption. Then archival review, no classified override. Then black archive confirmation, still nothing. Even covert registries had zero trace. That is when the concern shifted from clerical error to structural breach. Because erasing a man is difficult, but building a man who never existed, that requires architecture. The interrogator entered without a folder. That was intentional. No visible notes means no visible leverage. He sat, did not speak, let the silence stretch until most men would fill it out of discomfort. Subject 88 did not. His breathing remained controlled. 4 seconds inhale, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds exhale. Not military, not amateur, trained. The interrogator finally spoke, voice neutral, almost conversational. State your full name for the record. The man blinked once, slowly. You don't have a record. It was not defiance, it was factual delivery. They began with soft entry questioning, linguistic baseline calibration, accent mapping, micro-expression reading. His English carried no region, no London inflection, no Midlands trace, no Oxford refinement. It was neutral to the point of artificiality, as if assembled from multiple phonetic regions and averaged into something unplaceable. When asked about childhood, he paused, not searching for memory, but selecting response. There are places children go. I was in one of them. No nouns, no anchors, just abstraction. Psychological pressure escalated, sleep cycle manipulation, light frequency alteration, time distortion through irregular questioning intervals. Yet physiological readings remained stable, cortisol levels within range, heart rate consistent. Either he believed what he was saying, or he was engineered to withstand disbelief. Then came the deeper probe, not who are you, but who trained you, because no one survives this level of identity absence without design. When presented with fabricated images, fake childhood home, fake mother, fake military file, his pupils did not dilate. No recognition response, no denial spike. He examined them as a scientist would examine samples, detached. The breakthrough did not come from confrontation, it came from contradiction. An analyst in the observation room identified something microscopic. His blink rate increased only when shown satellite images of northern Russia. Not enough for human detection, enough for algorithmic flagging. The interrogator pivoted, not accusation, association. Tell me about winter. For the first time, Subject 88 shifted in his chair. He did not describe Russia, he described absence. Winter is when sound disappears, when the world reduces itself, when footprints are the only proof you were ever there. It was poetic, too poetic for a field operative. That is when the theory changed. He was not an infiltrator, he was a prototype. Because here is the strategic nightmare MI6 faced. If Subject 88 truly had no origin within any British system, then either a foreign intelligence service had achieved full-spectrum database penetration without detection, or a parallel internal program existed above standard clearance tiers, a compartment so deep that even oversight mechanisms were blind to it. The interrogation shifted from extraction to validation. They weren't trying to make him confess anymore. They were trying to determine whether he was theirs. A biometric deep scan was authorized, bone density analysis, isotope ratio testing in hair follicles to determine geographic upbringing. The isotope signatures suggested prolonged exposure to Arctic latitudes during formative years, but there was no immigration trail, no border crossings, no visa, nothing. When confronted with the isotope data, Subject 88 finally smiled, not arrogantly, almost sympathetically. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "You keep asking where I'm from. You should be asking why I was removed." Removed. Not born, not hidden, removed. That single word altered the trajectory of the interrogation, because removal implies prior existence. It implies deletion, not absence, which means somewhere, either in British infrastructure or beyond it, there exists a redacted layer of history. The interrogator leaned forward for the first time. Removed from what? Subject 88's eyes locked onto his own. From the record. And for a fraction of a second, less than measurable in courtroom time, but enough in operational terms, the interrogator hesitated, because if Subject 88 was telling the truth, then the danger was not that he didn't exist. The danger was that someone had proven existence itself can be erased without leaving forensic residue. The room felt smaller after that, not physically, structurally, as if the foundations of record, identity, and sovereignty had shifted. And that is when MI6 stopped trying to prove who he was and began to determine who had the power to make him disappear. The fracture really starts after MI6 realizes they are no longer interrogating a man, they are auditing their own architecture. Because once removal entered the equation, internal containment protocols triggered automatically. The observation room was cleared, data logs were mirrored to an air-gapped server, access permissions were temporarily suspended for 3 analysts without explanation. That doesn't happen during routine interrogations. That happens when an organization suspects internal compartmentalization beyond declared clearance tiers. Subject 88 was no longer a detainee. He became a variable. The next phase wasn't psychological pressure, it was systemic tracing. If someone had erased him, there should be microscars inside the system, timestamp inconsistencies, archive gaps, checksum mismatches in legacy servers. British intelligence systems are layered. Even classified records leave structural metadata shadows. But forensic cyber teams found something worse than tampering. They found symmetry. No overwrite signatures, no deletion markers, no corrupted clusters. It wasn't that his file had been wiped, it was that it had never propagated through the system at all, as if his identity had been constructed entirely outside sovereign infrastructure. That changes the threat level, because deleting data is espionage. Operating outside the concept of data is strategy. Meanwhile, back inside the room, the interrogator shifted approach. Not accusation, not coercion. He pivoted to pattern disruption. Who gave you your first name? Pause. Names are assigned by systems. I was assigned later. Later. There it was again, temporal displacement without origin. He didn't speak like someone hiding a country. He spoke like someone detached from citizenship entirely. No loyalty indicators, no ideological leakage, no resentment, no patriotism, just calibration. MI6 then authorized what internally is known as Tier Black comparison, cross-matching Subject 88's biometric profile against off-ledger operational assets from Cold War archives, deep files, assets that were never officially acknowledged. 3 partial matches surfaced, all classified, all presumed dead. That's when the strategic implication escalated beyond interrogation and into existential risk. Because if Subject 88 was part of a legacy ghost asset program, something designed during Cold War escalation, then either the program never ended, it evolved without oversight, or someone inherited it. And here is the uncomfortable question intelligence leadership faced. What if Subject 88 wasn't planted inside Britain? What if Britain planted him decades ago and forgot? The interrogation resumed, but the tone had changed. The interrogator no longer tried to destabilize him. He tried to provoke memory conflict. "You think I'm a person," he said. "I'm a contingency." That line reframed